All right, let's get started. So like last week, this week is a 1 week pass at a writer, at a thinker. So we're doing 1 week on Hegel as we did 1 week on Schiller. And then we are going to be jumping historically over a significant interval of historical time from the early 19th century to the late 19th century. So next time we'll do Nietzsche. And we're going to be doing 3 weeks of Nietzsche. The birth of tragedy. Then the second week of Nietzsche will be on the genealogy of morals, and the third week of Nietzsche will be the case of Wagner. And we'll see we're dealing with the early Nietzsche and the late Nietzsche. The early Nietzsche is the birth of tragedy, and also in Truth and Lie in an extramoral sense that we'll read the second week. And then the late Nietzsche on the genealogy of morals and the case of Wagner. So I think that I mentioned that music's going to be an important example in the course, and in part because two of our thinkers are musicians, Nietzsche and Adorno. So 3 of our thinkers are themselves practicing artists, Schiller, Nietzsche, and Adorno, but 2 of them are musicians. So Wagner will see figures differently in the early and the late Nietzsche. Early Nietzsche, Wagner's a positive example. So we'll look at an example of Wagner's music, as old as Liebestod, and then we will come back around to Wagner in the case of Wagner, where Nietzsche's a lot more critical, as he is on the genealogy of morals as well. So any volunteers for the first week of Nietzsche, the birth of tragedy? Okay, that's 1. Okay, great, thank you. Cool, and we broached maybe a little bit, we'll return to the way I lined up Schiller with Kant. There's a chart of terms on Canvas that also has as an adjunct to it Nietzsche, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, art as the combination of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So that's what we'll be discussing next week. All right, so starting us off on Hegel, I want to sort of introduce Hegel generally, and then get into this specific text, the Introductory Lectures on Aesthetics, that we read for today. So Hegel, you'll recall from Robert Pippin on the first day of class, the first week of class, in the On Critical Theory piece, he said we need Kant on appearance, then we need Hegel on dialectics and teleology, and then he said we need Marx on contradiction. So there's actually a distinction to be observed between dialectics and contradiction, at least to some extent, but we'll touch on that later on. So dialectics and teleology. Teleology, a word that we've encountered in Kant, with the final section of Kant's Critique of Judgment, with the example of the teleological beings, or the teleological judgment. So beings being the object of the teleological judgment. And that's really the culmination of Kant's Critique of Judgment. Now, teleology here, Hegel is misconstrued, misapprehended, misread, misinterpreted, and then people polemicize and reject the misinterpretation of Hegel. So we also had from Pippin the first week of class the grand narratives, right? The entire issue of grand narratives. Hegel on teleology, people think that Hegel has a teleology of the future, meaning that we're headed towards something in the future, and that's the telos, that's the teleology. It's actually not Hegel's perspective at all. Hegel's perspective is rather the present as a telos. So we are reading the Introductory Lectures on Aesthetics. Built into Hegel's perspective on art and its history is a philosophy of history. in Hegel's philosophy of history is to treat the present as necessary. So deal with the present not as an accident or a mistake or a wrong turn or a dead end, but rather the necessity of the present. And if you recall from Kant, the highest necessity is freedom. So what that means is the necessity of the present has two different aspects. One aspect is to treat the necessity of the present as the task of freedom in the present, meaning the struggle for freedom that we are engaged in the present is necessary. It's a kind of culmination of the past. And in that respect, it's connected to the struggle for freedom in the past. So the struggle for freedom in the present casts back from it a viewpoint, a perspective on the struggle for freedom in the past. So he's got a few kind of phrases that are associated with this. One is the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. The owl of Minerva, the owl of wisdom or knowledge, flies at dusk, meaning that we understand things, we come to an understanding of things, we come to knowledge of things after the fact. So it's ex post facto. And he also describes that as post festum. Post festum. So after the feast, then we know. After we've done things, then we come to understand what their real meaning is. So what that means is that knowledge comes late. It comes later than the action. We understand history retrospectively. So when we're dealing with history, one is not dealing simply with the facts of the past, but how we relate to them in the present. So the way that I like to chart this out is, and this will be important later when we read Nietzsche, in fact. So we usually think of, oops, this is messed up. All right, we don't really have this. Let's see. We usually think of historical time or time simply as a line, as a linear progression. But that's wrong. So it's not a matter of past, present, future, like on a line, but rather it's always a matter of the present relating to the past, and out of that relation between the past and the present comes the future. Okay. So what does that mean? History is that relation. So when we're dealing with history, we're dealing with the relation between the past and the present. There's a William Faulkner quotation. The past is not dead, it's not even past. The past is not dead, it's not even past. What does that mean? It means that the present also contains the past. So the past is continuing to act in the present. This relates to the dialectic of being and becoming that we've encountered previously with the is and the ought in Kant. And now we're going to get to nature and spirit, use of those categories by Hegel, which is to say that it's a dialectic of being and becoming. So it's a dialectic between what exists and its potential and possibility to become something else, to become new and different, to overcome itself. But everything that exists is also the product of past overcomings, past becoming. So everything that exists also became what it is. All right, so when we're dealing with the process of becoming, we're dealing with how the present relates to the past, how it incorporates the past, how it appropriates the past, how it interacts with the past. So if the past, if everything that exists is still acting, then our present action interacts with the action of the past. So this is the spiritual or geistic view of history. Otherwise, we're left with this kind of cleaving of like an inert past and an active present. No, there's an interactive past in relation to the present. Past is not dead, it's not even past. Okay, so nonetheless, what we do changes things, including changing the action of the past. So the past continues to act, but we can alter the way it acts in the present through our interaction with it. So in fact, what we do now changes the meaning of the past. It doesn't change what happened, but it changes how it plays out now. Right, so history is really about that. It's about that interaction, it's about that meaning. It's not merely the past in the colloquial sense of like inert past facts.
It feels like today there's a culture of like particularly people with a very capitalist mindset who ignore this and focus more on self-transformation via capitalism. Is that like a new thing, or were people still kind of having this mindset even maybe back when these were written?
I mean, it becomes something more in the proper capitalist era. I would say that it's something that happens more after Hegel. So this is an important point. We haven't gotten to the question of capitalism yet. We will with Nietzsche. So we are still in the kind of pre-capitalist moment with respect to the Marxist approach to capitalism. It's a market economy, it's bourgeois society, it's all those things, and we'll see how that plays a role for Hegel. But the kind of strangely atomized self that you're describing is like a later development. And it does emerge in the 19th century for sure. It's not only a 20th century thing, it certainly emerges in the 19th century. It's hard for us to disentangle later development from past precedent. So we might think that it's already starting to show up with Romanticism, right? And that's where we are sort of solidly this week. So last week we were kind of getting into Romanticism via Schiller. We were kind of charting the transition between classicism and Romanticism. Now we are solidly in the era of Romanticism. And that's why for Hegel, like the modern means the romantic. Modern means the current, the present is romantic. And he knows his romantics. He was a college roommate with Holderlin and Schelling, also a romantic philosopher. Anyway, with respect to the philosophy of history and the teleology, the classical ideal of art and the romantic ideal of art are related but different. So the classical ideal of art is like canonical. So basically, present art builds upon past art. And the history of art can be seen as a kind of cumulative development. Romanticism is a new apprehension, a new sense of history. But I mentioned the telos of the present, the necessity of the present, that the present is not accidental or mistaken or a wrong turn or a dead end. Why is that so important for Hegel? He's actually arguing against contemporaries who are experiencing their present moment as having gone off the rails, as having taken a wrong turn, as having ended up in a dead end. And he's resisting that. So he's saying, no, yeah, we do have a changed relationship to the past. We no longer have the classical sense of historical development, but that doesn't mean that we're lost now. That doesn't mean that we've somehow lost the plot. So there is a strange way that he is insisting upon the necessity of the present. Now, we talked about this last week with respect to the Jacobins and the French Revolution. Hegel, of course, is more associated with the later period of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic term of the French Revolution. And Napoleon is a very important figure for Hegel, and Napoleon is seen as someone who is saving the revolution, betraying the revolution. Right? So he's sort of a very ambiguous figure. And Hegel, while he has his criticisms of Jacobinism and of Napoleon, nonetheless also has to treat Napoleon not as an accident, but as necessary, as expressing a necessity. In order to avoid treating it as going off the rails. Right, so there is a sense of Romanticism, its self-conception, and its ironical disposition has to do with this kind of despair and melancholy at the loss of a tradition, specifically the bourgeois canonical classical tradition. There's sort of a sense of progress from the Renaissance up to that point. The Romantics feel that that's been broken, that they can no longer have that sense in their own time. And Hegel is saying, okay, something has changed, but we have to treat that change as necessary and as an advancing consciousness. And consciousness, I don't know if we've gotten into this language of consciousness hasn't really been operant for us yet, but it is with Hegel. Consciousness doesn't just mean what we think. It's not only theoretical, it's not just the understanding or concepts. Consciousness is practical. And indeed, consciousness is primarily practical. And again, that reaches back to Kant and the idea of the priority of practice. So practice comes before theory, we act, and then we understand what we did. Right, so consciousness is that. Consciousness is that dialectic of theory and practice, priority of practice, practical change, and it is connected to this L of the Minerva flying at dusk, meaning the world has changed through people's action, and then late afterwards we figure out what it is that happened, what it was that we did. And this is not just in terms of a quotidian experience of reality, but especially as regards historical time. So I think that I mentioned to you guys when we were talking about Schiller and the politics of the Jacobin moment, that these revolutions, the American and the French Revolution that come after the Enlightenment, are a late development, meaning they are the end of a long series of changes reaching back to the Renaissance, certainly, but also more proximally, more immediately, back to the 17th century. So the English Civil War and English Glorious Revolution. These things were extremely influential on the Enlightenment and are the precedents for the American and French revolutions. And so there is a self-consciousness of we are now in the late 1700s, Kant's time, coming to realize what it was that has been going on for a few hundred years since the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, all the Sturm und Drang, all the drama, all the wars, all the revolutions that are taking place. That now we can see what it means. Romanticism is putting a huge question mark over all of that. And that's why a figure like Napoleon is so important, because the question mark is, maybe we thought we were doing this, but actually it turned out to be something else. Maybe we thought we were making historical advances, but actually we were going off the rails. And that means that there's a crisis of consciousness, of faith in consciousness. And that's why Romanticism gets much more into a sense of historical inevitability and also like unconscious cultural realities, that it's not, the world is not transparent, the community is not transparent to itself, it's not just a function of enlightenment, it's a function of sensibility, and people are even unaware of what they're actually doing, especially as communities. Hegel doesn't dismiss this, but rather tries to take it on board and does try to deepen the philosophy that was initiated with Kant. So I think that I mentioned there's the 25 years of philosophy. There's this idea that Kant invented philosophy, that before that it wasn't really philosophy, because it wasn't true self-consciousness. It was some sort of post-theological metaphysics, but not really aware of its own conditions of possibility. And that Hegel completed it. So Kant initiated it, and Hegel completed it. And the reason that Hegel thought that he completed it is that, quite contrary to the Romantics, Hegel thought that there had been an advance in consciousness, such that the things that Romanticism considers to be liabilities are actually assets. So, from the Romantic standpoint, Romanticism exhibits a nostalgia for classical antiquity, the ancient Mediterranean world, also for medieval Christianity. And then also a kind of nostalgia for the Renaissance. Right? But the Renaissance is understood as somewhat different from what classicism might have thought of the Renaissance. The 1700s classical notion of the Renaissance was, the rebirth out of the Dark Ages. The Romantics have this other idea of the Renaissance, that it might have been the culmination of the medieval era, that it might have been a kind of culmination of Christendom, of Christianity. So there's kind of a change there. And it does have to do with how conscious are we of what we're doing, how conscious can we be of what we're doing. This is why psychology enters into it with Romanticism, and the nuances of experience and the paradoxes of experience become the preoccupations of Romanticism. Now, what Hegel does with this is this is from more standard histories of philosophy. It is the language that Hegel uses, but it can be misleading, so we have to be careful. The idea that Kant, and also Schiller, as a follower of Kant, were doing a philosophy of subjective idealism. So I think that I mentioned with Kant and with Schiller, we're dealing with the reality of the subject. Substance of the subject, the actual basis in and for philosophy of the subject. Hegel, conversely, thinks of his philosophy as objective idealism. Objective idealism. So subjective idealism and objective idealism. It's peculiar because, in fact, one can't draw a sharp line between those two things, meaning subject and object. There's a subject-object dialectic, so you never have an object without a subject, you never have a subject without an object. So what does it mean to say that Hegel's doing objective idealism as opposed to Kant's subjective idealism? So Kant starts with appearances. So again, Robert Whitman, we need Kant on appearance. And appearance is actually a deep issue. Phenomenal forms, phenomenal manifest basis for our understanding. So appearances, subjective appearances, how the world appears to us, treating that as necessary. Treating the way the world appears to us as necessary. Hegel also has that idea. However, the individual subjective experience might be an inadequate basis for fully explaining it. So already in Kant, the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, his follow-up book, short book, summary in response to critics of the Critique of Pure Reason, the first critique. Kant says there, of course, this isn't merely a matter of the understanding in concepts and theories. This is a matter of practical reason, first and foremost. And where is that practical reason based? It's not based in the individual, it's based in society, it's based in the social community. Okay, so he's already established that. Objective idealism follows up on that and tries to really elaborate that. Meaning, tries to put the question, more squarely in how the thing in itself, or how manifest the world as it manifests to us, becomes an object. So it's more concerned with how it becomes objective to us. And therefore, something that's not grounded immediately in individual subjective experience, Kant was always very careful that the subject and the subjective isn't merely subjective. It's not merely the particular individual. But Hegel's really pursuing that line of it, that aspect of it, and therefore he describes the system as that of objective idealism. This has misled people into thinking that Hegel thinks that ideas are objective in the sense of not subjective, almost in the sense of Platonic forms. Again, what we were dealing with Kant, like Platonic forms, do they exist somewhere out there? No, that's a misapprehension. So the idealism here is not traditional idealism. Neither for Kant nor for Hegel, but especially not for Hegel. And objective idealism also relates to how Hegel is underscoring and trying to elaborate further and deepen what Kant already indicated, which is that philosophy needs to be scientific. So what does the scientific character of philosophy mean? And we'll see it bears on something, he says, how can you be scientific about art? Scientific, the term is Wissenschaft. Science is Wissenschaft. And Wissenschaft is a broader category than our category of scientific in English, which is modeled on the physical or natural sciences. Wissenschaft is any knowledge aware of its own conditions of possibility. So that means you can have a scientific approach to the humanistic disciplines, like art and literature. You can have a scientific approach to the social sciences. So science doesn't only apply to the physical or biological or natural sciences, but would apply, there's a way of doing history that's scientific. Now, the reason that this has become so opaque to us or paradoxical to us, there may be other reasons for that we'll start to get into with Nietzsche actually next week. We might be troubled by this question in a way that Hegel was not, and also perhaps didn't have a reason to be. So he's using the term scientific in the broader sense, not in the narrow colloquial sense that we use it in English, especially today. Meaning, we would distinguish between science and philosophy today in a way that Hegel would not. And that's going to seem to present problems to us that it would not have presented for Hegel. Because he wouldn't have denied the specialization of knowledge or the specialization of different disciplines. That's not what it's about. And philosophy does have its own specific discipline. So there's the specific discipline of philosophy, which, as I described from Kant, is the technical explanation, or the attempt at a technical explanation of how these things work, how common sense operates. But there's also a broader sense of philosophy. And the broader sense of philosophy has to do with how the world has become philosophical, and how society and our relations to the world and spirit, Geist, has become philosophical. So in what way is that the case? Did we, I'm not sure that we did. We did the dialectic of being and becoming. The question is, have we done the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena? Have we not done this yet? We've not done it yet. Okay. All right. So just to review the dialectic of being and becoming, we're dealing with the question of transformation, freedom, and consciousness of freedom as a function of transformation. So geistic activities, spiritual activities like art, are domains in which we become conscious of our freedom. And that freedom has this, when thinking about it as a process of transformation, has this paradoxical or self-contradictory character because we're talking about two things at once that are hard to think at the same time, continuity and change. How does the new and the different come out of the given and the same? Now, the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena is how we might grasp what's in the process of changing. So I mentioned that phenomena are treated as necessary forms of appearance. This phrase comes from Hegel. Hegel says the essence must appear. Hegel writes the essence must appear, or the substance must appear. And what is the actual essence or substance? The true essence or substance? It's freedom. So the way things appear are necessary. So they're forms of appearance of necessity, but what kind of necessity? The highest necessity. And that necessity is freedom, namely that we change things. So human necessity is different from animal necessity. Animal necessity is just about being. Human necessity is about becoming, self-overcoming, change, transformation. So how is it that phenomena indicate this necessity for transformation and the tasks of freedom that are manifested? Well, the phenomena themselves give us the clues. So one approaches phenomena immanently, namely from within them. So in any given domain, we approach the phenomena immanently, but also dialectically, meaning how are the manifest phenomena exhibiting self-contradiction. So we're going to get into it today with how art is appearing in the Romantic or modern era. That it's appearing in a kind of self-contradictory way. And it appears to be in crisis. There appears to be an end of art in Hegel's time that the Romantics are registering. So the Romantics are making it seem like we can't really do art anymore the way the ancients did art. We can only make art about the fact that we can't make art the way they did. And Hegel's like, yeah, that's not quite it. There's a reason why it appears that way, but that's not quite accurate. Now, I brought this up at the moment I did in my lecture because when Hegel thinks that we live in a philosophical society, namely a society that's mediated, its manifest phenomena, its forms of consciousness, its spiritual forms are more philosophical in character. What he means is that they're more abstract and conceptual in character, as opposed to in the past, when manifest phenomena and subjectivity, consciousness, spiritual life manifested as moral in character, immediately moral in character. That's religion. Or as aesthetic or artistic in character, meaning the world seemed to be a matter of sensibility, feeling, rather than morality. Sentiment seemed to drive things, whereas now he thinks, in fact, what's driving things, our practical consciousness, how we're adjudicating the world, is more philosophical than it is a matter of sensibility or a matter of immediate moral kind of behavior and rules, piety. And so morality based on the sacred versus the profane. So we should always act in such a way as to preserve the sacredness of the sacred and avoid its profanation. So that's religion. So there are phases of spirit in Hegel's view: religion, art, philosophy. And we'll see next week with Nietzsche. Nietzsche's going to retread this similar ground. Meaning, what's the first way that humans become aware of their freedom? Religion. Because religion is the thing that we have that the animals don't have. Meaning, religion tells us to act contrary to our instinct. It demands that we not profane ourselves by giving into instinct, but rather act according to higher values of the sacred. So that's the first form of freedom. It's a form of freedom in practice, it's a form of freedom in consciousness, in spirit, in theory, in philosophy, theology. Our first recognition of our freedom is in and through religion. And we live in a religious community. We relate to ourselves, to other people, and to the world around us in religious terms. Everything is a religious cosmology. That's the first way that freedom appears. Good.
Isn't based on what Peter was saying, art, like immediate, they go together because from the understanding of religion needs to go immediately.
Has to present itself.
Yes.
That's right. So art and religion, it's the reason I say that it's, we'll see, but so religion first appears as a sensual appearance,
Yeah.
right? So art and religion are actually inseparable,
Yeah.
right? However, there is a point to differentiating this because in classical antiquity, but also in European Christianity, the religious phase was succeeded by an artistic phase. Meaning, the ancient Greeks and Romans started out with religious ritual. Art differentiated itself from religious ritual, took on a life of its own as art, and became the kind of dominant form in which people understood themselves. And that also happened in the Renaissance. So in the Renaissance, art separated itself from religion. It started out as like a high manifestation of religion, but then it actually distinguished itself from religion. And then that Renaissance, that sort of transcendence of religious consciousness, eventually became the philosophical enlightenment. In the same way that in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, after the artistic phase came the philosophical phase. So next week we'll see it's going to be very important. When Aristotle theorizes tragedy, it's because it's over. Right? So he has a philosophy of tragedy only after people are no longer experiencing it immediately as itself, but have to sort of explain it to themselves philosophically. And he thinks that that's what's happened in the late 18th century, is that society made the long transition from morality to sensibility to philosophy. Mm-hmm. Huh? He was very anti-religious, right?
He was talking about like aspects of religious, and then
Yes.
he talked about only specific things, or it's equal.
No, we'll see. It's through drama, first of all. It's through tragedy, because it started out, he thinks, as a Dionysian Saturn ritual. I guess we'll see. We'll get there next week. And this is all, Hegel already knows this, so Nietzsche's going to be putting a fine line on it, or a fine point on it. But the idea is that the world, or social relations, or self-understanding, or self-consciousness have become philosophical. Meaning, why did Schiller have to write the letters on the aesthetic education of man? Like, he's an artist. But no, he also has to explain how art works to people. Right? So art can't stand on its own anymore. It needs a philosophical consciousness for it to make sense. So you need art history, art criticism, aesthetic philosophy in a way that they didn't have in the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, art didn't need that. It was self-evidently what it was. There was no philosophical reflection and consciousness required to make sense of art. It immediately made sense. In the same way that religion originally doesn't need theology to make sense. It just immediately makes sense. And by the time it becomes theological, it's already transitioning out of its first phenomenal appearance. Right? So what he's dealing with is the Romantics saying, oh, we want art to just immediately make sense. It doesn't, and therefore this is a loss. And he says, no, the fact that we need philosophy to make sense of art is actually a gain. It's a gain not only for philosophy, but it's a gain for art itself, and it's also a gain for society.
So I don't really remember the sort of like final geographical outcomes of the religious void. All this that we're reading is basically coming out of Protestant countries, right? It's not just
Sure. Well, it's all Krauts all the time. Well, it's Germans. Yeah.
A moment ago when you mentioned like, the Renaissance,
Uh-huh.
about this break from religion, like that's really easy to identify in the North, but I guess I hadn't really thought of that being something that happened in the South.
Italy, yeah.
More just like reaction against that, right? The Temple Reformation and everything followed.
Well, it's a curious thing because you can't really turn it backwards, right? And so, like the Renaissance, the Southern Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance flies under the flag of Christianity, but in this kind of strangely bourgeoisified, secularized way. Like, politics enters into the church in this funny way, and they sort of mafia-dominant bourgeois families of the Renaissance, like they get fucking over with the church politically. As opposed to what the church was before, which was more of a fusion with the aristocracy. So the church would recruit aristocrats, and that's how politics was mediated, and you get this kind of bourgeois takeover. And you do start to have in the Renaissance a philosophical renaissance as well.
In terms of art, like aren't the Medici and these guys still pretty much commissioning religious themes? Like there's not really a thematic break where there is in the North, right?
Yes. Well, it's tricky, right? We'll be dealing with Raphael next week because Nietzsche makes reference to Raphael, and so we'll look at that painting, the Transfiguration of Christ. And what you see in the religious art of the Italian Renaissance is a humanized Christianity. You see that. And it's not. Yeah, I would say that we associate like the Northern Renaissance, especially like later kind of old masters.
That's golden age.
Yeah, or like totally in the bourgeois era. That's almost like beyond the Renaissance, I would say. Right. So, you get more political themes, yes, or more manifestly secular themes, as such, right? But again, the Romantics don't have any problem with that. So the question is, why is this romantic despair about art happening just in this time, like literally Hegel's generation, in a way that it had not happened before? Modernity, yeah, but in a way that's going to be different from what we addressed subsequently. So there is going to be something that comes after Hegel. So romantic just means modern. It just means current. But he also sees it going forward in a more self-conscious way, and then we'll see actually Romanticism itself goes into crisis, and that's what leads into modernism. So he's taking Romanticism as it is, reinterpreting its significance, and thinking that the future of art belongs to that, or at least the foreseeable future, the current time, the time that he's living. This is not really thinking about the far future. He's not thinking of the crises ahead. He's thinking of the crisis of modern society and politics, the state, again, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. How did all that happen? And what does it mean? And how do we understand it now? So, again, philosophy has a narrow meaning and it has a broad meaning. The narrow meaning is one is a philosopher. It's a specialized discipline. But the broader sense is that society is become philosophical. So there's the broader figurative meaning of philosophy, which is that we debate, we argue, we use concepts. The newspaper is filled with articles about plays and novels and paintings and music, and people are debating as not only to technical quality, but as to meaning and importance, significance. And he thinks that that makes sense. The fact that that has to be hashed out. That art is actually testing our prior concepts of it. And that we're having to develop new concepts and also new appreciation of art history. So there's a kind of revisiting of art history, and again, art history is being practiced for the first time in a scientific way, and also by non-artists. Right? So it's that there's a division between the critic and the artist, clearly, for the first time. And again, in the Enlightenment, that's already happening in the earlier period of the 1800s, the middle 1800s, but it's really coming to a head in Hegel's time. And again, it could be interpreted as, oh, art has lost its substance, and therefore now it's just too conceptual. It's all about ideas. Huh? Does this resonate? Does it resonate? Yes. And Hegel is there to say, don't think that that's a loss, that might be a gain. Right? That we are thinking about it, theorizing, reflecting philosophically on it, might be beneficial not only for our concepts of things, but also for the practices of art themselves. It might free the practices of art to develop more than they would if they had to rely upon the immediate sensibility of the community. So if art were more identical with the immediate sensibility of the community, it might be held back in terms of its development. Right? The fact that we're uncertain about the meaning of art might free art in a particular way to try new things in a way that it wouldn't have been able to before. Right? So again, the romantics are like, we don't know what we're doing anymore, it's all over. And he's like, no, it's just beginning. Right? So he's trying to flip the significance of what's going on in his own time. And as well as champion philosophy, of course, right? So definitely Hegel is like, you know, the role of philosophy is increased, but also philosophy is ready for it. Right? So basically starting with Kant and culminating with his own philosophy, he's like, we're ready for this. We can do this. People are ready for it. There's a public that can do this, and we can get into the technical details as philosophers, etc. Okay. Oops. So I don't want to get too much off base, but so going directive, idealism, history. Okay. A new sense of history also, a scientific sense of history. So I mentioned a scientific sense of art history. A scientific sense of history in general is also what Hegel thinks the world has arrived at in its own time. Meaning the fact that the French Revolution and its drama and happenings disenchanted people, did disenchant people, he's saying that's actually a good thing, because now we can soberly think about the realm of politics. We don't have to be carried on passionate illusions about things anymore. We have a scientific approach to politics, even. Imagine that. Right? Whereas clearly there was a kind of intoxication in the political realm that had happened in the French Revolution that had all sorts of negative consequences. And so the fact that the world is like sobering up in the aftermath of that, he thinks is a good thing. It's like a coming to consciousness. It means that maybe we can conduct politics without the kind of passionate violence of the French Revolution. Like maybe we needed to go through that phase, but now we don't have to do that anymore. Okay, so well, poor Fukuyama. You know, Fukuyama needs to be given a break, but Hegel definitely needs to be given a break. Meaning, we can't hold Hegel responsible for Fukuyama, But we also can't hold Fukuyama responsible for George W. Bush.
No, and Fukuyama's recanted himself at this point, so he's kind of washed his hands of.
I mean, he's just a liberal Democrat. He's just a whatever. He's like a whatever dude. And he's Nietzschean and Hegelian anyway. I mean, that might make it worse. That might not make it better. That make it worse. But anyways, nonetheless, poor Fukuyama, right? And you can trust him. He doesn't like Trump, right? You guys don't like Trump. Fukuyama doesn't like Trump. It's all cool. But that might be a limitation. I'm like, you know, children, what you're talking to me. I was never impressed. Yeah, I was never impressed. Meaning, I didn't care enough to dislike. I was just like, yeah, somethingality, right? But that's because I'm a crazy Marxist. So of course Fukuyama would never have impressed me. But that's a separate issue. We'll get to that later. All right. The present course of lectures deals with the aesthetic. Their subject is the wide realm of the beautiful, and more particularly their province is art. We may restrict it indeed to fine art. The name aesthetic in its natural sense is not quite appropriate to the subject. Aesthetic means more precisely the science of sensation or feeling. Thus understood, it arose as a new science, or rather as something that was to become a branch of philosophy for the first time, in the school of Wolff, in the epoch when works of art were being considered in Germany in light of the feelings which they were supposed to evoke, feelings of pleasure, admiration, fear, pity, etc. The name was so inappropriate, or strictly speaking so superficial, that for this reason it was attempted to form other names, such as the Callistic. But this name again is unsatisfactory, for the science to be designated does not treat of beauty in general, but merely of artistic beauty. We shall therefore permit the name aesthetic to stand, because it is nothing but a name, and so is indifferent to us, and moreover has up to a certain point passed into common language. As a name, therefore, it may be retained. The proper expression, however, for our science is the philosophy of art, or more definitely, the philosophy of fine art. So it's not philosophy of aesthetics, it's philosophy of art, and it's not really just philosophy of art, it's philosophy of fine art. So, fine art, what is fine art? What's the difference between fine art and art? Right? Art is the applied arts. Fine art is the pure arts. Meaning, fine art is art done for its own sake. By the above expression, we at once exclude the beauty of nature. Such a limitation of our subject may appear to be an arbitrary demarcation, resting on the principle that every science has the prerogative of marking out its boundaries at pleasure. But this is not the sense in which we are to understand the limitation of aesthetic to the beauty of art. It is true that in common life, we are in the habit of speaking of beautiful color, a beautiful sky, a beautiful river, and moreover of beautiful flowers, beautiful animals, and above all of beautiful human beings. We will not just now enter into the controversy how far such objects can justly have the attribute of beauty ascribed to them, or how far, speaking generally, natural beauty ought to be recognized as existing beside artistic beauty. We may, however, begin at once by asserting that artistic beauty stands higher than nature. For the beauty of art is the beauty that is born again, that is, of the mind. And by as much as the mind and its products are higher than nature in its appearances, by so much the beauty of art is higher than the beauty of nature. Indeed, if we looked at it formally, i.e., only considering in what way it exists, not where there is in it, not what there is in it, even a silly fancy, such as may pass through a man's head, is higher than any product of nature. So the most absurd thought a human being can have is higher than the sun in significance. Yes. Okay. Why is that? For such a fancy must at least be characterized by intellectual being and by freedom. In respect of its content, on the other hand, the sun, for instance, appears to us to be an absolutely necessary factor in the universe, while a blundering notion passes away as accidental and transient. But yet, in its own being, a natural existence such as the sun is indifferent, is not free or self-conscious, while if we consider it in its necessary connection with other things, we are not regarding it by itself or for its own sake, and therefore not as beautiful. To say, as we have said, in general terms, that mind and its artistic beauty stands higher than natural beauty is no doubt to determine almost nothing. For higher is an utterly indefinite expression, which designates the beauty of nature and that of art as if merely standing side by side in the space of the imagination, and states the difference between them as purely quantitative and therefore purely external. But the mind and its artistic beauty in being higher as compared with nature have a distinction which is not simply relative. Mind, and mind only, is capable of truth and comprehends in itself all that is, so that whatever is beautiful can only be really and truly beautiful as partaking in this higher element and as created thereby. In this sense, the beauty of nature reveals itself as but a reflection of the beauty which belongs to the mind, as an imperfect, incomplete mode of being, as a mode whose really substantial element is contained in the mind itself. Moreover, we shall find the restriction to fine art very natural, for however much has been and is said, though less by the ancients than by ourselves, of the beauties of nature, yet no one has taken into his head to emphasize the point of view of the beauty of natural objects and to attempt to make a science, a systematic account of those beauties. The aspect of utility, indeed, has been accentuated, and as science, for example, of natural things useful against diseases, a materia medica has been compiled, consisting in a description of minerals, chemical products, plants, and animals that are of use for curative purposes. But the realm of nature has not been arrayed and estimated under the aspect of beauty. In dealing with natural beauty, we find ourselves too open to vagueness and too destitute of a criterion, for which reason such a review would have little interest. The above prefatory remarks upon beauty in nature and in art, upon the relation between the two and the exclusion of the former from the region of the subject proper, are meant to remove any idea that the limitation of our science is owing merely to choice and to caprice. But this is not the place to demonstrate the above relation, for the consideration of it falls within our science itself, and therefore it cannot be discussed and demonstrated till later. Supposing that for the present we have limited ourselves to the beauty of art, this first step brings us at once into contact with fresh difficulties. The first thing that may suggest itself to us is the difficulty whether fine art shows itself to deserve a scientific treatment. Beauty and art, no doubt, pervade all the business of life like a kindly genius, and form the bright adornment of all our surroundings, both mental and material, soothing the sadness of our condition and the embarrassments of real life, killing time in entertaining fashion, and where there is nothing good to be achieved, occupying the place of what is vicious, better at any rate than vice. Yet although art presses in with its pleasing shapes on every possible occasion, from the rude adornments of the savage to the splendor of the temple with its untold wealth of decoration, still these shapes themselves appear to fall outside the real purposes of life, and even in the creations of art do not prove detrimental to our graver purposes if they appear at times actually to further them by keeping evil at a distance. Still, it is so far true that art belongs rather to the relaxation and leisure of the mind, while the substantive interests of life demand its exertion. Hence, it may seem unsuitable and pedantic to treat with scientific seriousness what is not in itself of a serious nature. In any case, upon such a view, art appears as a superfluity, even if the softening of the mental temper, which with preoccupation with beauty has power to produce, does not turn out to be detrimental because effeminating influence. In this aspect of the matter, the fine arts being granted to be a luxury, it has been thought necessary in various ways to take up their defense with reference to their relation towards practical necessities, and more especially towards morality and piety. And as it is impossible to demonstrate their harmlessness, at least to make it credible, that the mental luxury in question afforded a larger sum of advantages than of disadvantages. With this view, very serious aims have been ascribed to art, and it has been recommended in various ways as a mediator between reason and sensuousness, between inclination and duty, as the reconciler of these elements in the obstinate conflict and repulsion which their collision generates. But the opinion may be maintained that assuming such aims of art, more serious though they are, nothing is gained for reason and duty by the attempt at mediation, because these principles, as essentially incapable of intermixture, can be parties to no such compromise. Let me jump ahead here. So I'm using the ebook version of the text that you guys have from the Penguin version, so that we're sort of on the same section headings. Okay, the element of art was said to be in its general nature an unworthy element, as consisting in appearance and deception. The censure would be not devoid of justice if it were possible to class appearance as something that ought not to exist. An appearance or show, however, is essential to existence. Truth could not be, did not appear and reveal itself, were it not truth for someone or something, for itself and also for mind. Therefore, there can be no objection against appearances in general, but if at all, against the particular mode of appearance in which art gives actuality to what is in itself real and true. If in this respect the appearance with which art gives its conceptions life as determinate existences is to be termed a deception, this is a criticism which primarily receives its meaning by comparison with the external world of phenomena and its immediate contact with us as matter, and in like manner by the standard of our own world of feeling, that is, the inner world of sense. These are the two worlds to which in the life of daily experience in our own phenomenal life we are accustomed to attribute the value and the title of actuality, reality, and truth, in contrast to art, which we set down as lacking such reality and truth. Now, this whole sphere of the empirical inner and outer world is just what is not the world of genuine reality, but is to be entitled a mere appearance more strictly than is true of art, and a crueler deception. Genuine reality is only to be found beyond the immediacy of feeling and of external objects. Nothing is genuinely real but that which is actual in its own right, that which is the substance of nature and of mind, fixing itself indeed in present and definite existence, but in this existence still retaining its essential and self-centered being, and thus, and not otherwise, attaining genuine reality. The dominion of these universal powers is exactly what art accentuates and reveals. The common outer and inner world also no doubt present to us this essence of reality, but in the shape of a chaos of accidental matters encumbered by the immediateness or sensuous presentation and by arbitrary states, events, characters, etc. Art liberates the real import of appearances from the semblance and deception of this bad and fleeting world, and imparts to phenomenal semblances a higher reality born of mind. The appearances of art, therefore, far from being mere semblances, have the higher reality and the more genuine existence in comparison to the realities of common life. And he goes on from that. So let's unpack that. This is a very important point. So he thinks we can't deal with aesthetics as scientific because it's too subjective. But then he says that the actual substance of things is in its subjective reality. Art in particular is deceptive because it's about illusion, it's about making us see things that aren't really there, it's making us experience things that aren't actual and practical fact. But because we're aware of that being the case, it's actually a truer deception than everyday reality itself, which he says is a crueler deception and more misleading. And is in some ways a falser deception because it's misleading. So it's precisely because the world as it appears to us is taken to be reality that it's the crueler deception, whereas with art we're aware that it's a deception and therefore allows us to see through the deception. And so everyday life doesn't allow us to see through the deception, art does. What did you guys make of this? Because this is pretty much the opening salvo of the text. I don't know if you, let me see if you guys addressed in your notes. Right, so our common understanding of what is true and what is real, that actually art allows us to, okay, you guys, neither of you guys really addressed this, okay.
Well, I deleted the first half of my notes
Why?
because he said 2 to 3 bullet points, and it was a lot.
Okay,
I felt like it was not organized.
okay, but
That happened.
you had written, yes?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Passage, please, read out loud.
Yes.
So like, I understand like where he's getting vocabulary of deception from, going all the way back to like Plato.
Yeah, yeah.
Greeks.
Mhm.
So like there's this sort of genealogical like soundness to the term, but I feel like by the time he gets into his own articulation, like maybe I'm a little confused, but like I don't see why it's considered deception anymore, because
Right.
the appearance is like
Right.
necessary for revealing the truth. It's actually not a deception. It's like it's an affirmative revelation at that point. So why does he stick to this sort of like what becomes for him anachronistic vocabulary? Or is he, I mean, is he just sticking to the term, or am I missing something?
No, you're right about this. So he is sort of defeating the term as well as taking it up in a different way. So he says the essence must appear. That phrase shows up here. It shows up elsewhere in his philosophy, but it shows up already in the opening paragraphs. And that therefore this is a challenge to the traditional notion of the difference and opposition of appearance and essence. And so the idea in traditional philosophy was that essences are true, appearances are false. And so the world is, the phenomenal world is deceptive and false. The noumenal world, only the noumenal world is true and actually essential. The phenomenal world is inessential. The noumenal world is essential. Okay, so already from Kant we know that he's kind of flipped that. Kant already did that. He didn't get into the issue of deception in the same way that Hegel is accentuating here. And the reason for that is actually related again to the philosophy of history. Which is to say that for Hegel, and again this is part of the dialogue with Romanticism, Kant sort of skips over a problem. So for Kant, we act, and then we recognize what we did, and then we develop our understanding, and then we continue to act. There's this kind of very straightforward kind of enlightenment notion of consciousness and its development. For Hegel, each step of the way is embroiled in misrecognition. So Hegel has to emphasize the point that actually we only advance our recognition through misrecognition. that first we have to misrecognize things before we can recognize things. So here's a way of putting it that's very pithy and hopefully not too paradoxical for you guys. Every recognition is actually a misrecognition. And every misrecognition is actually a recognition. So for instance, religion, what we were talking about earlier, religion. So religion is a misrecognition of freedom. So we attribute to God what is actually our own doing. So we treat our own acts of freedom as if they're divine interventions. We treat prophets as if they were divinely created to give us the message of God, but actually they were people who broke new ground in the state of freedom. Right? And yet, there was no way that we could not have recognized it through that misrecognition. So there was something necessary about that misrecognition. And it only becomes a misrecognition in hindsight. In other words, like there's no point really, I mean, other than the fact that there are these clashing civilizations in that sector. We have Pontius Pilate and Jesus, and Jesus is like, is he a prophet? What is he? Is he a political revolutionary? No, he's the Son of God. What is that? And then like Pontius Pilate is like, yeah, you Jews are religious fanatics. I don't know what to do with you. And, like you seem like a reasonable guy. I don't really want to crucify you, but whatever. Kind of keep the natives down. The natives are restless. They're demanding your execution. Right. So Pontius Pilate can say, okay, this is like not real, But again, that would be like maybe apples and oranges. And then of course, like in the Gospels, like God intervenes to like make Pontius Pilate crucify Jesus, and not like where Pontius Pilate is like, yeah, I don't want to crucify you, but then God like makes Pontius Pilate do it. So it's weird. But generally speaking, Hegel thinks the misrecognitions are avoidable. And moreover, the recognition will reveal itself later to have been a misrecognition. And it will only be a misrecognition from the standpoint of the later development of consciousness. Meaning in its own moment, it is a recognition. It is true, in other words. So religion is true. It's not like, oh, now that we know science, we can say religion is false. Yeah, but how did that happen? And anyway, science came out of religion via philosophy, yes, but you can't really disentangle these things. So Hegel, again, introduces, in a way that Kant sort of skips over, the necessity of deception.
When you put it that way, I can kind of see also how just like Hegel's like styles coming in, like deception as negation, so now he's negating negation.
Absolutely. Meaning, we're motivated by our deceptions, and so they're consequential, but then, again, they lead to something that sort of retrospectively invalidates them. Right? So it's a curious kind of spin that he's putting on things. And again, you could say that that's like making a huge difference between Kant and Hegel, but not necessarily so. Not necessarily so, especially because when we're reading the teleological judgment, and Kant says, well, we must necessarily see the world as designed even though it isn't. Right? So, for example, right, so we have to attribute like intelligent design to nature that isn't really there, and yet that is like the immediate reality for us. Right? So it's sort of, but it's underdeveloped in Kant. Okay, you were gonna say?
Oh, I was going to say that truth is like the dissolving of opposition. So like the opposition between what is actually true and what we know that is imperfect and incomplete. And so in that sense, art is crucial despite being
Artificial, is that good?
was like deceptive.
illusion.
Illusion, something like that.
The truth of illusion. That would be a nice Hegelianism. The truth of illusion. Meaning illusion is not accidental or arbitrary, but necessary. Right, so whatever illusions we have about the world are motivated. They're coming from somewhere. They're coming from our own subjectivity, and our subjectivity has substance. And that's why you can say even a silly idea in someone's head is truer than the sun, which has no truth in itself. So again, the truth is born of the false, right? So we have to sort of, in order to advance truth, it's a moving proposition. That would be maybe what I was thinking of as you were saying that, which is that truth is a moving proposition, and therefore truth never just is, it's always becoming.
That is the deception.
Right, well, it becomes only through advancing through falsehood. Right, so basically, we develop the truth through falsehood. Right, which again is completely, different way of using these terms and hopefully not merely paradoxical. But the easiest way of thinking about it is everything we think is true now, in the future people will look back and be like, yeah, that was false. And yet it is true for us now. And yet it is true for us now. We act on it, we live through it, and it does grasp something. But what does it grasp? It grasps our relation to things. So nature has no internal relations in Hegel. Like any internal relations we ascribe to nature are just a projection of our relation to things.
So it's objectively deterministic.
Well, it's objective in the sense of what objects are for us, and also because we are relating to things, and therefore does have to do with those things. But it's not as if, here's another way of thinking about it, because Nietzsche's going to do this too. In 2 weeks, we'll deal with this in Nietzsche. Humans, right? So we didn't always exist. Right? So when humans didn't exist, then the continents were in a different formation, and we had Pangea, and the Earth was rotating around the sun, and the sun was part of the Milky Way galaxy, except none of those concepts existed. And those phenomena existed. Right? The dinosaurs were going like, oh, we're on the Earth, and we're rotating around this node. Right? So whatever merely existed, it had no truth in itself. So our conception of things, which again is always changing, our understanding of things is always changing. And so now we say we live on a planet in a solar system in a galaxy. But perhaps in the future we'll have a different way of thinking about these things. We'll have a different way of thinking about what the planet is and how it relates to the solar system. I mean, already in the physical sciences, they have a very complex understanding of these things, of just what is and is not, kind of variable and constant and recurring in the solar system. So again, he's dealing with that.
So is he saying that what is determined by how we think about it? That what we think is the concept of reality itself?
That's phenomenon. That's phenomenon, but not as noumena.
Well, but again, the noumena,
But I mean, it's like.
the noumena, it's kind of like, okay, so and where would that be exactly? Or we only know the noumenal through the phenomenal. Again, what we want is to posit an existence independent of us. And yet, that existence independent of us would not be pondered at all.
But I realize the sort of euphoria that we're brushing up against here, but doesn't Kant do it anyway? He calls them things in themselves. So even though we have no, even though we couldn't reflect upon human through a phenomenal experience, it's still giving them a name that indicates an independence from phenomenal experience. He could have called them anything, right? He could have called them things in themselves.
Yes. Yes.
Included that they actually are.
No, he wouldn't say so, but just, I mean, just, you know, it's like what you name something indicates what you think about it, right? Like, he could have called them like.
So you know, religious
things
people
you
think.
can't fully know or something.
So religious people think that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. Are you aware of this?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Why? Why is the Earth only 6,000 years old?
Yeah. It's the Bible.
Right. Right. So Scripture. Right. Meaning the story of expulsion from paradise, Adam and Eve, Adam and Steve, meaning the beginning of time. Right. Because there was no time in paradise. There was no time in Eden. So when Adam and Eve are kicked out of Eden, then time begins because mortality, temporality, the passing of things begins. Right, so there's like the beginning of time, and before that there was no time. And not only that, but there will be an end of time. There will be an end time, but that will be will return to the kingdom of God, where there's no more time. And where all the dead come back, are resurrected, right, including all the animals, all the nature, everything that has lived will come back and live eternally. That'll be awesome. Okay, so now, we don't think that anymore. Why is that?
Science?
Yeah, but science, right? But
Maybe I'm dating.
sure, but like, why does that matter?
It indicates a disparity
A shift in the school of thought from the religion and art to science and.
Philosophy. But again, why? Like, why? Like, meaning, we started doing like physical experiments, we started like changing our relation to things, and then it became important for us to know geological time in a way that thousands of years ago it didn't matter. Like, it didn't matter to anyone how old the Earth was, to have accurate estimations of the age of the Earth. For us, it matters because of the way we practically relate to things. Like, it actually impacts our engineering, our chemistry, our physics.
You're asking like why we rationalize time in the first place.
Yes.
Capitalism.
Well, sure, but not just capitalism. Because capitalism actually fucks with that pretty severely. Like, meaning, I don't know, if we listen to Eric Weinstein, this guy, Intellectuals of the Dark Web, of course. Brad Weinstein is the brother of Eric Weinstein, right? Eric Weinstein's the physicist. And then Peter Thiel also, like, they have this idea that like physics has come to an end because it's become like bureaucratized and self-serving, and so no one's really doing science anymore, they're just pretending. Like, there's just a total bankruptcy of like scientific equipment. Probably it's true. On the humanities side, I can kind of say our history, it's just like pushing paper around. Like, no advances have been made in understanding for more than 50 years. Definitely. We're pure semantics. Right, but anyway, so what makes the advances in science possible, what motivates it, what makes it necessary? Like, that's what we have to think about. Right, so for all intents and purposes, like, I just have the voice of my husband in my head, who's Muslim, and there is part of him that's like, yeah, the Earth is only 6,000 years old because the Quran says, like, literally, right? And yet, of course, he knows otherwise. But for all intents and purposes, it depends on how you're referring to time. Right? If you're referring to like historical time, the time of religion, the time of the prophets and revelation and all this stuff, then it's pretty much 6,000 years.
There's no necessity to know how old the Earth is or whatnot.
Yeah, it's kind of like, but it gets them into conundrums because it's just like, well, the humans exist with dinosaurs. Because there are these bones, dinosaurs, and Like the dragons exist, right? Like where do people get this idea of dragons? And aren't there these funny like bones that might not be a dinosaur, but might be something else? Like right? So, but the thing is, again, we experience this kind of, we're going to get into Nietzsche, but Hegel's already introducing it. Separation of the subjective and the objective. Like, he is sort of optimistic about it, Hegel, which is that this is just a kind of specialized division of labor, meaning physics think of historical time in one way, and political science thinks of historical time in another way, and theology thinks of it in another way, and maybe art history thinks of it in another way. Like, because even though these things coexist and are related to each other, there are different histories involved. But there are different historical temporalities. Right? Maybe art changes on a different tempo than science. And maybe both of them change differently than politics in the political realm. And maybe all of those change at a different tempo than religion. So, you know, in terms of the object, but it's a moving proposition in the sense that even in those discrete domains, there will be a change. One can be sure that there will be a change. That it's not as if the truth that we have now will be permanent. Right? We thought the world was made of atoms. It turns out it's not. It's made up of quantum particles, subatomic. Why? Because we encountered practical difficulties dealing with things in chemistry and engineering and physics, observable phenomena that the atomic theory didn't explain anymore. And then we did things that show that atoms are not the most primordial form of matter. But that will be revised again at some point, maybe, hopefully. No?
So based on you explained from each of those points, like past is still like going on present. And we talk about like change things about because of the period of time because it's in the science. Even the change in the future is not going to be 100% defined, right? Because
Well, it'll be based on the past still. It'll be built upon the past, and it will be built upon the past in a way that's different than in some domains than in others. So he does think the history of art will maybe figure for people differently than the history of science. So the history of science, it becomes just a sort of antique curiosity to think about past theories of science. Nonetheless, one develops new theories of science on the basis of the old theories of science. We may not be as interested, although we are, people write histories of science. They do. So obviously there is some interest. But it seems that art has a historical life that's different from science. And so yes, so everything new is based on what exists and what was old, yes. And nonetheless, also can represent a total overturning, especially at the level of truth, meaning, etc. Now art, interestingly, specifically, art takes kind of unanticipated turns and yet somehow remains still art. And so that's one of the things that he's going to teach, because you can say that the romantic conception of art is a deep crisis and maybe a complete overturning of the older classical view of art, at least in the bourgeois era, and yet still remained art. It's not as if it became unrecognizable with respect to past practices. And so I think that that's, you know, again, if we take truth to be a moving proposition, that will help us. Now, another point would be that something like art, but also something like science per se in the broad sense, that art is only art by virtue of the fact that it changes in this way. Like the fact that art is constantly changing its definition is in fact what makes it what it is.
This might be a kind of weird question. I don't exactly know what I'm asking, but so if I guess the sort of unique ability of art that he's sort of like defending here is sort of like an illusion that makes you aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering why it is, not necessarily that I disagree with him, why he thinks that the sort of central or aesthetic component of that is like so central, and what like makes it. Like the first thing I think of is of like illusions that make you like self-conscious of them. I was trying to think of like, is there a version of that in science? And I feel like you kind of get like, I don't know, like paradoxes where you can use logic, like Zeno's like motion paradox or something, where it takes traditional understanding and shows how it presents an untruth in some way. And I feel like that does the function that he's doing without it, that he's ascribing to art, without the sort of aesthetic component.
Right. So, a phrase we're going to encounter next week is the appearance of appearance. And Hegel's already trying to address that now. In other words, art is concerned with the appearance of appearance. So it's concerned with the significance or the meaning or the truth of sensual appearance. So it's not just, okay, it's appearing in this form, but it has this other content. That actually, the form is the content. When thinking about... Yes. What do you mean by language?
Language as in, like, the appearance is the vehicle that holds.
A meaning.
But it's not, I don't, the language is kind of like a doubling.
Yeah.
Kind of like it's supposed to be unified. Like it's more like the form itself, right? Unless language is the form, but like the form of a word or something.
So I was thinking of language in a broader sense and not just
communication.
Verbal. Oh yeah, communication.
Or just representation.
All right, so the term that he uses, so he introduces mediation, but another term, and it's tied to this term, phenomenon. So in German, it's Erscheinung, and so it's ultimately translated as phenomenon, semblance, and appearance, but it's the same word in German, and that's Erscheinung. And Erscheinung is, just as it sounds, it's kind of a shining forth or shining through. So, expression, right? So the idea that a work of art expresses, so it doesn't represent in the sense of like standing in for something, but it expresses something. Right? So, this is where theories of representation are going to fail us, and also semiotic theories are going to fail us. Because it's going to be like kind of a system of signs that, you know, we're going to get into that kind of language. That's not really going to help us with Hegel, because for Hegel, it's about how form expresses the content, rather than just being a container for it.
Emanation.
Yeah, that's right. Like a shining forth, emanation, expression, and a mediation. Because what's meant by mediation is that the mediating factor is actually necessary. It's not like you can cut out the middleman, right? But we can only, so there's an experience that you can have only in art. That you can't have.
talking about art is limited, because even though we touch on the external qualities of it, it's not actually getting the depth and experience.
That's right. And yet we have to talk about it. In other words, we have to try to describe it. We have to try to conceptualize it, try to theorize it, try to understand it in those terms. And yet it's the non-identity that is, in fact, like the key piece of it. Right? So the experience of art and the theory of art, there is a necessary disparity and non-identity, and yet the truth is actually in that disparity itself.
Which is its identity,
Right.
or its totalization.
Right. So mediation, this notion of mediation in Hegel is very tricky because, again, it has a different connotation than what we might think. We think of mediation as reconciling, but also mediation is where contradiction manifests. So mediation is where non-identity manifests, whereas we think of mediation as like how identity is achieved between things. He's saying, yes, that's true, but more importantly, it's where the non-identity is manifest as well. So the fact that, for instance, we've talked about this before, all human communities, all human cultures, everyone at all times in all places, art has existed. Right, so there's a necessary mediation in this form of appearance, namely art.
So in like, so in the dialectic model that he's like using, in the synthesis, they are like the mediation, it's unresolved, right? It's still this kind of like tense state.
Yeah, that's why it's not it's Fichte who has the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Hegel doesn't actually have this. And the reason is because it's not overcoming but preserving.
It's not quite a synthesis.
Right. And at least that's what he thought was wrong with the Fichtean model. There's also another problem with the Fichtean model, which is that it's about the intersubjective. So there's basically Kant is the subjective, Fichte is the intersubjective, and then Hegel is the objective, right? Which is supposed to contain both the subjective and the intersubjective. So he's using that term objective in a very peculiar way. So art, as a necessary mediation, it means that art is not really conventional. In other words, art isn't simply what we call it. It's not like we agree intersubjectively to call this thing art. He thinks no, art has a reality beyond that. There's an objective reality that's actually informing our subjectivity and our intersubjectivity. So our ability to communicate about art isn't itself determining what art is, but rather art is determining how we talk about it. Right, so that's what gives it the objective idealist character rather than the merely subjective idealist or the intersubjective idealist. Because Fichte is like, well, Kant's right, except what about others? Right, so it's not just this individual subjectivity where this experience happens, but it's an experience between people that we're really concerned with. So there's an intersubjective. And Hegel says, well, but there's still the question of the object. Right? So, there has to be something that not just I am dealing with, or that we are considering, but also it is making us what we are, both individually and collectively. That's why art can be an expression of objective spirit. Because it comes from history. It's not like we're reinventing art de novo all the time. No. We are being informed by the past. And we're developing it out of the past, even where it appears to be a total overthrow of the past. But still, that is a continuity of the past. But even when you're overthrowing it entirely, negating it, you're continuing it. Right, so again, he's sort of filling in some details that are glossed over in his mind and Kant. And the reason it's not reconciled is that would suggest that it can be reconciled. And it can't. And the reason that it can't be reconciled is that history will never end. Why will history never end? Because freedom will never end. In other words, at no point will we be done emancipating ourselves. We will always be, it's a very Rousseauian idea, we talked about this last week with Schiller. In our freedom, we're always producing new problems that we will then have to emancipate ourselves from. So when we emancipate ourselves from one problem, we create a new problem that will demand further emancipation, and that process will never end. If it did, then it would suggest that actually freedom is not free. Right? It would suggest that freedom is determined rather than open-ended and absolute. By the way, that's what absolute means. Absolute means it has no inherent limit. Right, so it's not like once we overcome this unfreedom that we're experiencing now, then that will be the end. No. And the reason for that goes back to the issue of misrecognition. Because what we think we're overcoming now, and then even in totally overcoming it, there will be something that we haven't overcome that we're incapable of apprehending, and then it will manifest. So we will free ourselves of something, but then actually we will be creating the new unfreedom, but not out of nowhere, out of the past that we thought we overcame, but we did not. Right, so it's a very complex notion of historical time that again is not linear. Not linear. It's recursive, it's repetitive, right? It's the constant interplay of past and present. Right, so that's, in a nutshell, why he needs to bring in the objective dimension, because we're always kind of creating an objective situation. It's not like we become subjective and therefore everything becomes totally transparent and we recognize everything, but that never happens.
To go back to the art, the sort of sensational side of it, and then you were talking about mediation.
Yeah.
Would it be correct to say that that sort of element of like the experience of art is the mediation between the actual relationship between the illusion and truth, and then the person who perceives it? And okay,
mediation is essential. That goes to what I was just saying about transparency, meaning because misrecognition will never be entirely done away with, therefore things will never be sort of immediate. Here's another little Hegelianism. What appears immediate to us is actually most mediated. But we're not always capable of seeing the mediation. So with art, the advantage of art over ordinary existence is that the mediations of art are more apparent, whereas the mediations of reality are more kind of implicit and not apparent. So they're explicit in art, they're implicit in reality, and it's easy to overlook them in reality, whereas it's difficult to ignore in art.
I have a question. So it's kind of like this idea of this like retro-mutative treatment of history. I guess I'm looking. I was going to ask this earlier, but maybe like in this context would be a good time to ask it. I'm a little unclear. I mean, I sort of think I know what you mean, but I'm a little unclear when you say like the sort of like Hegelian teleology can't be considered like oriented to the future. I mean, why couldn't it be like, it seems like it's oriented toward, mutative, but nevertheless like horizons, right? Like he's talking about. So in what sense do you mean that it's like kind of caps off at the now and isn't a kind of future teleology? Like, I don't really see how that break even makes sense in this system. The break between now and the future.
Well, the future isn't determinate, but the present is determinate.
Okay.
And the present is determinate in a kind of complicated way. Meaning it's not determinate, it's not like the past determines the future, but rather the opposite, which is that the present is determining what the past is for the present. Right, so that's the determinate negation idea, but the future is not determinate like that.
Right, and so I guess what made me think of this, there's an article that I've read recently, or like an essay, kind of talking about how like, with the sort of like, with the horizon of like climate collapse especially, but more generally just kind of like capitalist planning, that like there's this kind of paradoxical situation where like the future actually does determine, like the present is actually a reflection of like projection to the future, right?
Sure, yeah.
Kind of almost kind of inverting this formula, right? Like the present is trailing behind the projection of the future and constantly reform for the sake of this like imagined future.
Oh yeah, we certainly do that. In other words, we do project futures that then determine our course of action now.
Right.
But that might be to our disadvantage. In other words, that might be a projection of the present, but it's unwarranted. In other words, we might naturally do that, but that doesn't mean it's right. In terms of horizons, so there are horizons and there are horizons. So, of course, in some sense, in some irreducible sense, there are physical limits. On the other hand, how we think of physical limits is based on our present practices, and so what we now treat as a physical limit in the future might not be.
And also, a moment ago, you said, like, you might naturally do that. I think at least in this essay I'm referring to, the argument was sort of the opposite. It's a very, like, timely argument, like, it's because of capitalist forecasting that there's this.
The way they're acting now.
Yeah, that, like, it's not something that always was. It's just like our
Right.
current configuration of now is being dragged forward by the kind of projection in the future, which is specifically a capitalist experience.
It might be, like kicking the can down the road. Yeah, it might be. Climate change.
I mean, or like even think of like, budgets cuts here in the school, right? Like, hey, we're not projected to hit our numbers, so we're gonna preemptively like make a bunch
It becomes a
cuts now.
self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah, the self-fulfilling prophecy is a problem. But again, we're capable of saying that. We're capable of saying, don't do a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And we're capable of saying, capital speculation might have an interest that it makes itself true. Or something like that. Right? That's pretty straightforward. Thought of just in the realm of fine art, in the realm of like art. So, that art changes, it advances, it develops, and it continues through changing what it is. Right? So art seems to have an expanding definition relative to the past, and yet also still remains what it is. Right? So the whole question of art, not art, is productive, it's not defeating, it's not a mere aporia. It actually is constituting what art is. That what once was not art now is, and what once was art we now find insufficient, inadequate. Like if we did that, it would sort of fall short of art in some way. It'd be some kitschy cultural practice. It wouldn't be what we expect of art anymore.
Sorry, again, back to the mediation and the thing with like paradoxes. I guess, I think I know what I was trying to say now, is that in the case of like this paradox that's like self-evidently not true, the act of like presenting that, I feel like the same mediation exists in a situation like that than it does in art, in which case there's the actual sort of setup of the problem, then the person's reaction to it that points beyond our current understanding of like logic in this case. But then there is an actual sort of, I don't know if you want to call it an aesthetic reaction, but there is some judgment that the subject needs to feel about the setup that's given to them, that makes them feel that dissonance such that they know that, such that it expresses the sort of insufficiency of the current understanding. And I'm wondering, I feel like the two possibilities in my mind are either that there's a way that like logic, like either science or philosophy, depending on what you want to call that sort of thing, fulfills the same purpose as art as he says only art can do, or that something like that actually is art.
You have to get more concrete than that. I'm not sure what you mean in that last sentence especially.
I guess if like you can create a thing that doesn't really have an aesthetic, it's not art, it's not painting or sculpture, and seems to come from just logic and understanding itself, but still has both the setup of, and then a mediation that a person aesthetically reacts to, and that aesthetic reaction points towards the untruth of the deception. It becomes a self-conscious deception. Either it feel like it's doing what art does, or in itself it is art. It's just without a sort of like formal side to it, but
And yet it would
Does
have
that
to
make
have a
sense?
formal presentation. So we kind of dealt with this with Kant a little bit, where he's talking about oratory, rhetoric, and we get into like humor and these kind of logical conundrums and why we feel them the way we do. So if you recall, these things are not entirely separate things. So feeling is always operant, no matter what we're doing, right? And again, feeling of the beautiful seems to be more about the object. Sublimity seems to be more of a subjective thing. And then teleological beings is more that interplay between subject and object, where we feel that the object is alive in the way that we're alive, and our notion of life, etc. Okay, so, but the art of rhetoric, the art of oratory, the humor, especially when verbally presented, like there is essential mediation, right? But even if it's just the processing of the joke, if you will. So what do we mean by the sensual? It doesn't have to be the plastic arts. So the plastic arts, painting and sculpture. It can be, a poem. And it can be a poem that's not read aloud, but just read on the page. In other words, it can be essentially a thought process or a verbal thought process. That would still count as a sensuous mediation, because it would still be mediated by something. And it would be mediated by something that isn't purely semiotic, logical, communicative. Right? It would be about the wordplay, in which words cease to mean what they ordinarily mean in the context of the poem. So you would still have a sensuous mediation. So I think that that's also what he's talking about, which is what we think of as art at the level of sensuous mediation, that has changed. Now, we did look at the Casper David Friedrich, the painting, The Wanderer Over the Sea of Clouds, right? Okay, so what's remarkable about that painting is how little it is sensuous, right? It's very kind of monochrome, toned down, almost black and white. It has some subtle use of color, but basically, it's kind of dry at the level of visual presentation. It communicates something sensuous, like a kind of experience, like the kind of vertiginous experience of being in a physical space, but minimally, like very minimally. And so it seems to be far more conceptual in character, and yet still is sensuously mediated. And so the question is, what to make of that kind of romanticism, where the artwork, okay, so here's some other language that we didn't talk about with Schiller. Naive and sentimental poetry. So naive poetry is the poetry, and he's using the term poetry broadly to refer to any art form, that tries to be nature, versus sentimental, which points to nature and is like a longing for nature. So sort of being nature versus pointing to and longing for nature. So these two kind of ways that art can function, that it can itself become the instance of something or try to be the instance of something, or it can sort of point to something rather than being it. And the Caspar David Friedrich painting isn't actually doing it experientially, it's more pointing to an experience than it is actually enacting it. And yet, we can still talk about it as a sensuous mediation, even if it seems to lean more in the conceptual than in the visual. Right. And why? Because feeling. Right? In other words, it's speaking to our feeling. It's speaking to our feeling in a more conceptual way than in the visual way. Right? Which then asks the question, should that have been a painting? Or should it have been a poem? Or should it have been a passage in a novel? Or should it have been a piece of music? Right? And that's why it isn't, because in any of those other ways, if it had been mediated, if that idea had been mediated in any of those other ways, it actually would be different than the way it's mediated through the visual art of painting. Right? So that's what Hegel's talking about. And I think that I mentioned this when we were doing Kant, the difference between emotion and feeling. Right, emotion is more sort of internally generated, although even that's a kind of a funny idea in and of itself, whereas feeling is always feeling about something. Right, so it's about like the externalization, the object. So I think that that's what's meant by sensuous mediation and the inevitability of that. And also, let's keep this in mind. Feeling is a realm of historical change as well. That's something that we haven't touched on yet. So we should take a short break, but let's come back on that point. Because he says, what are we looking at when we're looking at like the history of art? We're looking at the history of feeling. And our feelings about things have changed. Again, Kant has one clear passage on that in the Critique of Judgment when he talks about the sublime and about how monotheistic religions seem to be more about the sublime than what came before, than like the polytheistic paganism. Because the concept of God and what God was in relation to humans was different. And so, but Hegel is really focusing on that. And when we're looking at the history of art, we're looking at the history of feeling. And that we haven't always felt the same way about things, about ourselves. He talks about representations of deities. He says, when gods were beasts, it's because mankind was beastly. And so why were gods beasts, and then they became more and more human, and then they ceased to be human? So like, Allah or God or Yahweh, they're not human. They're not representable as human. And so that's an interesting thing to consider as well. Gods went from being beasts to like people, and then beyond what could be considered a person. Okay, let's take a short break. Resume. So we only have a half an hour left. Let me also say about like the dynamics of history. So the note that he ends on, I think, is important to consider. He says, now therefore what the particular arts realize in individual works of art is, according to the concept of art, only the universal forms of the self-unfolding idea of beauty. It is as the external actualization of this idea that the wide pantheon of art is rising. Its architect and builder is the self-comprehending spirit of beauty, but to complete it will need the history of the world and its development through thousands of years. Okay, so again, the recursive aspect of it means that what art is doing in the present is also changing what art was in the past. So we're constantly mining the history of art. So it's a kind of infinity not only of the present and therefore implicitly of the future, but it's an infinity of the past. Right? So it's not as if, again, the sort of linear conception of past, present, future would be that somehow the past exhausts itself in the present, and then the future comes when the present has exhausted itself. It's rather that we're kind of never done with this, which means that the past is always yielding new kind of resources. It's, the past is an infinite resource. And the reason that the past is an infinite resource is that the present is unlimited in its unfolding, in its process of becoming. So as we're unlocking the freedom of the past through the freedom of the present. It's going to be important later in the course.
But it's not, it's going to complete it.
Well, it would need the history of the world, right?
Right, but
To complete it, we'll need the history of the world in its development through thousands of years. So, obviously, he's speaking very figuratively here, meaning that, the self-comprehending spirit of beauty. Right, so to complete it would require a kind of bottomless past, thousands of years. Right, he's not being just descriptive there.
But then, sorry, I'm a little confused. Is he being literal in the sense of he sees history as having a terminus? Because we talked about it earlier in the class about how this endless process that never stops. But now he's saying it complete itself. So I just don't know how.
To complete itself.
Well, what does that mean?
Right.
How does an endless process complete itself?
Okay, maybe that's another way of getting at the issue of the present. So the necessity of the present, it's non-arbitrary, it's non-accidental, it's non-mistaken character, means that the present actually does culminate the past. Meaning the present is necessary in the sense that it does actually accumulate and complete the past, so the present is completing the past. However, that's not a terminus. That's just at any present moment, the past is completed. But it's not ending. It's not terminating. Right, so he does use the end of art idea in two senses. One is the telos of art of the past leading to the present. And the present hasn't jumped the guardrail or something. It's the romantics might think. So the present is the necessary result of the past, not accidental or mistaken. It's a necessary result of the past. But it will be succeeded, and in being succeeded, will cast a different past behind it. Meaning, what comes after us will also be the completion of the past, even though we appear to be the completion of the past. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to look at.
Oh, let me zoom in more.
I'm trying to figure out what exactly in a specific sentence it is referring to. The it that will be completed is.
And I zoomed in, of course, it totally changes the placing of the page. Okay, hold on. Yes. What the particular arts realize in individual works of art is only the universal forms of the self-unfolding idea of beauty. Right? So every work of art is realizing this, and it is the external actualization of this idea, as the external actualization of this idea, that the wide pantheon of art is rising. This wide pantheon of art that's rising has an architect and builder, and that's the self-comprehending spirit of beauty. But to complete it, to complete the wide pantheon of art that is rising, it will need the history of the world and its development through thousands of years. Right, so
I understood the way you laid it out. I'm not sure that I buy that in the text. It's
Okay.
maybe saying something else. But I'm not sure, so I don't know.
okay. Let's see if the previous paragraph helps us. The concrete form of their relation to the individual arts is of such a kind that the several arts constitute the real existence of the art forms. Meaning it's only in their separation that they become one thing. Symbolic art attains its most appropriate actuality and greatest application in architecture, where it holds sway in accordance with its whole conception, Mid, no. That's a typo. Is not yet degraded to be the inorganic nature as a word dealt with by another art. For the classical form, on the other hand, sculpture is its unqualified realization, while it takes architecture only as something surrounding it, and cannot yet develop painting and music as absolute forms for its content. Finally, the romantic art form masters painting and music, and poetic representation likewise, as modes of expression in a way that is substantive and unqualified. But poetry is adequate to all forms of the beautiful and extends over all of them, because its proper element is the beautiful imagination, and imagination is indispensable for every beautiful production, no matter to what form of art it belongs. Right, so again, that first sentence, the concrete form of their relation to the individual arts is of such a kind that the several arts constitute the real existence of the art forms, meaning it's only in relation to the other art forms that this happens. So it's got a kind of development, like architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry. So that seems like a sequence, seems like a kind of a line of development. And yet even architecture only becomes what it is by virtue of the later development. So, when he's saying this historically, there was a time when the only art he's saying is architecture, which is kind of a weird way of putting it. Meaning, there were discrete objects or whatever. But basically there were ritual places where the community gathered. So cave painting, is cave painting, or is it architecture? Because after all, you had to be in the cave. So it's an in situ image. Right, and then notice that things separate themselves from their physical situatedness increasingly. Right, so sculpture is the first instance of that, and then painting is even more so that, and then music even more so, and then finally poetry, which seems to be the most abstractable from its physical situation.
The use of the word beauty here, because I know even Kant went beyond that into the sublime, but does that take into account other impacts that art can have besides beauty? Or, is it just used as sake of
Broadly.
Just a word to use here?
Yes, that's right. Because I think that for him, the beautiful, it doesn't have that specific character that it had in Kant. That the beautiful is rather the sensuous sense of things. So if something makes sense in terms of its sensual appearance, he's calling that beautiful. Right, so if it sort of has a kind of coherence, it has a kind of phenomenal substance to it, he's calling that beautiful. So we sort of comprehend what Kant was talking about in terms of the sublime and the teleological being. I mean, in another sense, it's in keeping with Kant, because Kant thinks that they're all varieties of the pleasurable feeling. So the sublime is a pleasurable feeling, even though it verges on pain. And of course, the teleological being also gives us a pleasurable feeling. So that Hegel's using it that way. And the pleasure that we get is the pleasure of sense. Yeah, completeness. I mean, it also goes to the completeness issue has to do with Romanticism too, because Romanticism seems to be about like a kind of missing piece, like something is left out, or there's a kind of a gap, or kind of a distance. There's a kind of of brokenness. There's a kind of incomplete character, but in the sense of something missing. And what he's saying is, at no point is anything ever missing. Right? Meaning each present moment is complete, which is, again, a curious way of thinking about it, because it's also by virtue of that incomplete. Right? But you have to treat it as complete, because otherwise you might think that something's missing. And Romanticism is all about that. It's all about what's missing. And he's trying to overcome that understanding of it. Right? Because if something's missing, then it would give the present not an unnecessary aspect. Right? So he's sort of insisting upon the world as it is complete in itself. It doesn't mean it won't overcome itself, but it also means that we haven't lost the plot. Right? So it's not as if we can treat the present as incomplete, because that would suggest perhaps that the past was incomplete, and yet each past moment was complete in itself. So it's a bizarre way of thinking about completeness, what that means. It's not a static notion of completeness. I think that that's important. I mean, that's why I emphasize, is rising, it is being built. Okay. So, Marina. Yeah. Let me zoom in on there. It's a bit. Would you like to guide us through what you were raising?
I'm gonna make it short, since we've been talking a lot about so Hegel's organized arguments of great necessity is pretty stop stays born based on how well the spiritual idea expresses itself in the senses of sensuous women. Art starts from the symbolic form like architecture. Symbolic art is unclear and how the poet's form can really show a deep spiritual idea. Classical form is actualized by sculpture. This is the biggest kind of beauty because artifact balance where the spiritual idea finds its ideal. Harmonious realization in the beautiful human form. And the next romantic form of poetry and music is like Hegel was playing as like a highest one of the biggest historical stage with that, where the content pure, infinite, subjective, transcending the physical, and the spiritual is not powerful, making the senses for I try to analyze life, and Hegel was explaining all of it. It was actually easier to read, but it was hard because every sentence you compare like with Cutrone then all the way. So basically I tried to explain it by breaking down the states that he was kind of like mentioning early after the except the base of the
The divisions, different kinds of art. So it's somewhat different from the notes that are here, but we'll come back to it. Emily?
The notes that I posted are mostly like me trying to make sense and not have an opinion, because I tend to read philosophy and like read it for my own opinions, which is actually in fact not reading philosophy. So that was just me trying to make sense. I feel like we didn't talk a lot about the like universal, particular, and final part of specific centers into all five of those relations in the common spiritual processes and forms of artistic interpretation.
All right, so the three categories are the particular, the universal, and the final.
Yeah.
Okay.
And pretty straightforward, right? I don't know why he's categorized.
Okay, so one of the things that he's dealing with, and we touched on this a bit with Kant, but it's not really developed, is that like categories are not imposed on the material, but sort of emerge from the material. So again, like Kant's critique of Hume, Hume just treated any kind of analytical, theoretical, or conceptual categories, any concepts, any theories, as more or less fictions, and they're kind of disposable fictions, and they're generalizations from empirical data. They have no substance in and of themselves. Kant and Hegel, by contrast, think that no, we have these theories, concepts, understandings, categories, because there's a real object. There's a kind of a substance to it. And then the question is, well, again, what is that substance? And the substance is, again, a moving proposition. It's in a process of change. What that means is that the universal is only universal by virtue of particularizing itself. So the universal category of art is itself constituted by the individual works of art, by the particular instances of it. So that's different from saying, well, we have all these different things, and then we just have this kind of handy generalization that's more or less conventional. We agree upon what fits within this category, and we exclude other things. He's saying, no, there's something more of intrinsic value, substance to this category of art. That it actually is present in all the individual works, in all the particular instances. Right, so it's a different, it's not a, like I said, a kind of superimposition of the universal category onto the particulars, but the universal category arises from the particulars. Now, how is that? Well, as the practice of art expanded, also our knowledge of the world and of history expanded, so that, in fact, a lot of things that in the past would not have been considered art now would be considered art. Right? So he has to explain that. That's the philosophical problem. So all cultures have art, and across history and across geographical space, there were very different things that we now understand under this universal category of art. But in their own moment, they may not have recognized each other as art. But now, we can recognize all of it as art. At least in the way that he's using this term, art. So, for instance, how is architecture fine art? It seems like architecture is not fine art, and yet we can regard architecture as fine art in the sense that it's contributing to this history of fine art. It's sort of participating, right? It becomes a particular instance of art. So that's how he's using those. Now, of course, final is like complete. It immediately connotates to some kind of static object. But it's really a culmination. So the particular gives rise to the universal, and then the universal then rebounds back onto the particular. So the universal is actually this substance of all the particulars, but then once you have that universal category, it changes the way we look at all the particulars. And it's that union of the particular and the universal that's the final. That's what final means. It means the kind of combination of the particular and the universal. But of course, when that happens, that's not an endpoint. It doesn't stop there, but it actually usually yields a whole new set of particulars and a whole new conception of the universal.
What I don't get is that he claims over the importance of like individualization and artistic beauty, but then later talks about the defectiveness of art if the content isn't absolute.
Right, so that has to do with the periods of history that I see more productive and fruitful in terms of artistic creation. So it actually relates to these three categories that you come to in your notes, the symbolic, the classical, and the romantic.
Yeah.
So what's interesting here is that it seems like the symbolic is not really yet art. It seems that art only becomes itself in the classical phase, that it's like the symbolic phase is like kind of proto-art, and then art becomes itself in the classical phase, and then it goes into crisis in the romantic phase. And yet, in another sense, of course, in each moment, it is complete,
Yeah.
right? It is complete, and then the hard part is how to understand the romantic as itself a form of complete rather than as a kind of terminus or something, losing the plot of art.
Yeah. He even claims that in romantic art, there's like a higher form of it on an individual standpoint because it matches like heart and soul more purely.
Then the classical.
Yeah.
That's right, because the classical, from the standpoint of the romantic, still seems too external.
Yeah.
Right? Still seems too arbitrary rather than.
I was confused with that word because like he's talking about Greek God and the Christian God, but it's kind of like one of the classical thing, but why is not the end? Because like it's kind of what it's speaking about. The talking.
So these are two different examples. Okay, so the Greek gods. Okay, so that goes to the religion, art, philosophy thing. The Greek gods only become like themselves when they cease to be gods and become aesthetic kind of symbols instead, right? So the symbolic seems to be very much connected to the religious, but when the religious symbolism becomes religious symbolism, then actually it's become art, and it's no longer religion. But paradoxically, when it becomes art, then the religious symbol actually becomes itself in a way that it wasn't before. Right? So that's the interesting thing about the symbolic phase, and there are two. So there's classical antiquity, then there's medieval Christianity. So medieval Christianity is symbolic in this sense. And it's symbolic not only in its like representations, in like medieval like religious painting, but the religion itself is symbolic, meaning it's the union of like reason and feeling. Right? So symbol, by the way, always means the combination of things. And so the classical, by contrast, appears to be the separation of things. So if symbolism combines things, then the classical seems to be about separating art from religion, or like religious feeling from sensuous representation. So they're unified in the symbolic. They become separate in the classical. And then, but they're not experienced as separate until the romantic. Right? And so,
Like the music and art and certain things, so you have to compose something like that?
right, so it's about this separation and reunification. That's the movement that's going on. And so, again, like, the example, I think I brought this up, the Amadeus example, Mozart, the movie. Right, so like, he's literally doing court music, and he's doing religious music, and then he's doing commercial music, right, for the bourgeois public. And he really is having a different experience composing in each doing. Like, the music is different, and yet it is all music. And so it's about like Mozart like exemplifying, and it's a rather late development. Like, I think that it's only happening in the 1700s, but nonetheless, let's go with this idea that Mozart is not just a craftsperson that's just being put to this or that task, like religious music, court music, bourgeois, popular commercial music, but he is actually an artist. Like he's not just a craftsman who's just doing what he's assigned into his domains, but nonetheless feeling them to be different. Like here, I'm amusing people, and here I'm sort of entertaining and providing the pomp and circumstance of the powerful, and here I'm actually communing with God. Right? So he has that, right? And yet he's an artist. Meaning it's music, and as music, it transcends all those domains.
So in a classical phase, in the Catholic countries, like wasn't there kind of like a separation, but then a re-intensification of the religious connection with the Reformation, like kind of pulled away Protestantism pulled completely from the
I was going to say, Protestantism becomes a kind of ban on the representation.
right, but
And
in the
then-
South it went back.
And the Counter-Reformation Catholics like double down on like the propagandistic aspect of the imagery, but then we see that as lesser than what it was before. We see that as lesser.
He doesn't quite
Yeah.
say.
In other words, it's kind of forced. It's kind of like, whereas the truth, I mean, of course, Hegel is trying to follow this path of Protestant Christianity and the necessity of it, rather than thinking that it's the collapse of Christianity, which is what the Catholic Church thinks. And so he thinks that maybe the rejection of the sensuous is a necessary moment in order to then sort of return to the sensuous, but in a different like meaning, right? So again, overcoming the symbolic and attaining the classical, you have two parallel things. So you have the rejection of religious imagery by Protestantism, while you have an explosion of secular painting. And that seems, one seems to require the other. In other words, would you have an explosion of secular painting if Protestantism didn't reject religious imagery? Because that's part of freeing painting, in a way. Even though it's a kind of narrowing of what painting is, so it's no longer sort of divine in its character.
Yeah, well, free to the market.
Free to the market, but the market's not too shabby. In other words, it's the free association of people, it's cosmopolitan, it's all these things in a way that the traditional church cannot be. Right, so again, but the punchline, if you will, is the romantic, because the romantic is this funny kind of crisis of both the symbolic and the classical, that seems to defy that progressive movement of the symbolic to the classical. It seems like romanticism is like turning off that path, and yet actually is a reinscription of what came before. And in some ways, we haven't gone past the romantic phase, actually. So in some ways, modernism is different from romanticism, but in other ways, modernism is a continuation of romanticism. Meaning, it is this kind of strange oscillation between the symbolic and the classical, meaning we sort of narrow art, and then we also broaden art at the same time. You were going to say? No?
With all of this, just all of the stuff that like art does, how it acts, would you say that Hegel, I guess, thinks that this happens and it functions this way regardless of whether an audience or a viewer is conscious of this? Or is there some necessity of a subject that's thinking about it in this way, even if not using these words, for it to do what it does?
Well, thinking it is tricky, right? Experiencing it, certainly, because otherwise it wouldn't happen, right? And the artist and the audience. So he does, look, Hegel's infamous the zeitgeist, the Weltgeist, the zeitgeist, right? The world spirit in a particular moment in time, the zeitgeist. He does think that such a thing exists, right? So that would encompass both the producers and the consumers, both the artists and the audience. Otherwise, kind of couldn't happen. But also, it's not merely conventional, right? So it's not like artists are imposing their will on the audience, and the audience is complying, nor is it that the audience is demanding something of the artists, and the artists are just complying. Right? There is still a meaningful separation of the artist and the audience. There's an interplay. But again, what would comprehend all of that would be the zeitgeist, and specifically its movement. Right? So there's a movement involved, meaning something had to have happened for both the artists and their audience to move from the symbolic to the classical, and also to move from the classical to the romantic. It would have to be happening on both ends.
Is that merely an analytical distinction? He's thinking about society moving, he's thinking about history moving as a whole, right? So he's not really thinking of like separate movements, right?
And yet it does happen in discrete locations. So in terms of his philosophy of history, he does think that there are places and times without history. There are blank pages in history. So there are places and times without history. And yet there still is history. Right? There still is universal history. Because ultimately the local history is taken up and becomes part of universal history. And yet reinforms what that local history was in its particularity. Yes, that's right. And what I'd say about this is that, we associate like Hegel with totality and this kind of thing, but we have a misapprehension of that, because in fact what's important for Hegel is difference. In other words, a difference is created historically. So it's not like we start out different and then we become the same. It's rather we start out the same and become different. And that's the movement of history. Right, so differentiation, that's sort of enriching of not only the present, but the past. So in retrospect, the past becomes far richer than it was in its own moment.
Well, also becoming fertilized, right? It's like both.
It's both, but it's by virtue of both. In other words, by virtue of a cosmopolitan civilization, the differences in history are further elaborated. And so they, in their own moment, they would have only been a sort of a shadow of themselves in terms of their later significance. So now we can sort of appreciate the differences of different moments in the past and different cultures in a way that in their own moment could not have been appreciated by the people inhabiting them or by others. Right, so it's only by virtue of the universal that the particular can become the particular. That's his point. Right, and it's a retroactive process. And it does happen through a kind of romanticism. So we think of the Enlightenment as like, homogenizing, Eurocentric, colonialism, blah, 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 blah. No, the Enlightenment philosophers were very interested in like the very fine differences between different cultures, and ultimately of their own time. And ultimately, this becomes an appreciation of the differences in the past. Right, so it starts out as a kind of, Native Americans are just as like cognitively rich and culturally sophisticated as Europeans are. But the Middle Ages was still some backward shit. Where people were just like dreary, like Christians. But then the Romantics come along and they're like, actually, the medieval is far richer than we thought. Right? So that difference is recognized, and also it's, again, appreciated, and in a sense becomes itself. The difference actually is a result. It's not like a starting point. So it's not like we start with all these different things and we throw them into the blender and they become all the same thing. It's rather, no, we're distilling. That's part of the pantheon and the thousands of years. We're constantly distilling things out, differentiating. That's the movement of history. We're particularizing. And are able to recognize and value and appreciate that difference in a way that was not possible in the past.
surprised that lasts 9,000 years. I wonder if I'm being hung up for the wrong reasons.
Thousands of years.
Yeah, but am I thinking of the right? The Republic end with like a similar.
Plato's Republic?
Plato's Republic. Doesn't it end with a similar like something thousand years?
Possibly.
I wonder if that's what he's doing there and not actually.
Possibly, maybe, I don't know. Off the top of my head, I don't recall, but possibly. But then we have to remember that Hegel's talking about real history and Plato's talking about antiquity.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't see him like necessarily going back to Plato in that way, but it's just.
Well, certainly he had read Plato. Like,
Yeah,
certainly everything is still in dialogue with Plato and Aristotle,
No,
for sure.
I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
he kept his book off with a Plato reference, unless he's being like snarky or something, I don't know.
It wouldn't be snarky, we would be taking it and giving it another meaning.
Okay, so,
So,
yeah,
it
if
could
any
be.
gesture, yeah.
It could be. I just, like I said, off the top of my head, I don't recall.
Yeah, I
it.
don't know if I'm thinking the right book.
All right, thanks, guys.